Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so looking forward to because it's a great combination of roasting some books and praising some books. That's right, today I'm going to be chatting through all the books nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards, specifically for the fantasy genre. I think we all can agree that the Goodreads Choice Awards is basically just a popularity contest. I'm very rarely surprised about which book is going to win, and I am usually never in agreement if it is actually the best fantasy book of the year. Nevertheless though, the new titles have been dropped and we have 20 titles that have been nominated in the opening round for the best fantasy reads of 2022. For the books that are on this list, I have either read a majority of them or have at least started the series that the book itself is nominated in. There are 3 titles that I have not read, so I will just kind of mention and move on. Today we're going to be digging through the entire list and I'm going to be letting you know if the book itself is worth the read or if it's one that you should skip. Without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in. I literally just have the web page up and we're just going to scroll through, if you will. First book that's on the list is The Book Eaters by Soon Yi Dean. I have not read this. I own it. It's on my shelf and it's a book I feel like I personally would really enjoy. This is an atmospheric, kind of bizarre fantasy story about a group of people that eat books for sustenance, and when they eat those books, the stories themselves kind of imbue within them. Again, I can't let you know if this is a great book or not because I have not read it myself, but it is one that I am very curious about, and I'm curious to see how many votes this will get because this is kind of a smaller fantasy novel. It doesn't have a huge amount of reviews, which brings me very easily into the next book, which I think is a top contender to actually win this award, with a few others that are like on this list, and that is House of Breath and Sky by Sarah J. Maas. This is book 2 in the Crescent City series. I have an entire reading vlog dedicated to this book. I've talked about this book numerous times on my channel. I did not like it. Before anyone comes and yells at me in the comments, I generally enjoy Sarah J. Maas's books. I love her cast of characters, her numerous romances. I find them to be very addicting, hard to put down, and generally very, very entertaining. I actually liked the first book of this series. Actually found it to be all right and actually rather compelling. So I was honestly looking forward to picking up book 2 within this series, but unfortunately, I hated it. If you're not familiar, the Crescent City series is Sarah J. Maas's like urban fantasy, romance fantasy series. We follow our main character Bryce, who's like a party girl, young, wild, and free in this city, which is comprised of a lot of different supernatural, paranormal, and fantasy creatures. Beginning of book 1 though, Bryce's life is turned upside down when a series of murders impacts her friend group, and from there she begins working with this like angel detective. There's a lot of will they, won't they, you get the picture. Book 1 again was fun. Book 2 was so bad. The pacing was off, the characters were off. I found everyone to be so unlikable, and nothing really happened in the plot for such a long book until the very, very end. Needless to say though, even though I gave this book 1 star, I think it will be at least in the top 3 for the best fantasy book of the year. Next on the list is a very cozy option, which is actually a perfect book to pick up in this fall-winter season if you haven't already, and that is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is such a fun fantasy read, and I'm also excited to see that there are a few like very charming and cozy fantasy options just within the list itself. And in this story, we follow our main character Viv, and after many years of packing steel as an orc barbarian and being a part of various mercenary groups, Viv is looking to hang up her sword and finally pursue her dream, which is opening up a coffee shop. And this book is literally that. We follow Viv as she arrives in a town, kind of pick out the perfect place, and slowly build this new community institution and watch her follow her dreams. We see her trying out new recipes, making new friends, hiring employees, and it's just an unbelievably charming time. This is a very low stakes fantasy novel, nothing that's going to kind of blow your mind per se, but it's definitely one that feels like a warm hug. There's a reason why this sort of went viral in an early part of this year, because it was just a really delightful read and one that will just kind of like pull you out of real world stress. You know, if you want something that's just going to put a smile on your face and charm you, this is a great book to pick up. I don't think it's like the best fantasy book of the year, but it's definitely one that I applaud and really enjoyed myself. Next up, we have Ordinary Monsters by J.M. Miro. This is the first book to a new gothic, Victorian, historical fantasy series with a lot of atmosphere, weird magic, very much like Umbrella Academy vibes, if you know what I mean. I think the series has a lot of potential. It wasn't perfect in my opinion, but it was an entertaining read overall. In this story, we are introduced to basically our 2 main characters, which are Charlie and Marlowe. These are two young kids who have mysterious powers, and basically at the beginning of this book we also follow our other main character, Alice, who is a disgruntled female detective hired by a very mysterious magical school to locate magical children and escort them safely to this institution. The reason why they need escorts is that there is a mysterious shadowy man who basically hunts down magical children around the world. This book was good. I liked the writing. I loved the characters. You will fall in love with Charlie and Marlowe and so many of the side cast of characters as well. I think it really was able to maintain this air of mystery and strange atmosphere, which I think is really key to a Gothic novel. That being said, though, it is pretty long, and I'm not so sure if the pacing made sense for the length, if you know what I mean. In general, though, I'm intrigued by this. I love kind of a Gothic, very atmospheric fantasy pickup, so I'll be reading on for the rest of the series, but again, I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but I would say it's still definitely worth checking out, especially if you love historical fantasy stories. Next up, we have A River Enchanted by Rebecca Ross, which is one of my favorite new fantasy releases of the year. This, again, is a perfect example of a story that I just love. I love any fantasy story steeped in beautiful writing, folklore, storytelling, like any of those things always calls out to me, and A River Enchanted has that in spades. In this story, we follow our main character, Jack, and Jack is a bard, and he is from a very magical and strange island, but he has been away from his home for the past 10 years to actually get his training as a bard. However, at the beginning of this book, he receives a letter from home asking him to come back to basically help participate in an investigation that's happening on the island because a lot of young children are going missing. This island, the one that Jack grew up on, ruled by wild magic and capricious kind of elemental sprites, and it also has a long history of conflict. On this island, there are two groups of people that have been at odds for many generations, and due to this conflict, the island itself is cursed. On one side of the island, and for the people that live there, they have like flourishing crops. They're able to grow and maintain like anything they need to survive, but the magic there is deadly and bears great consequence when you use it. On the other side of the island, the land is basically barren, but the magic is very, very strong. Jack returns home. They think these missing children have to do with this long existing conflict, and Jack himself has to work with his childhood nemesis to try to figure out what is going on. This book is just so beautiful. It has so much to do with like history and again storytelling. I loved the writing style. It's multi-POV, and I was just sucked into the overall vibe of this book, and I would agree it was one of my personal favorite releases of 2022 in the fantasy genre. On the same note, we also have Nettle Bone by T. Kingfisher, another very strange and very short fantasy book that absolutely knocked my socks off. Again, another very winning recipe for me because this is like a dark fairy tale-esque story, which I just love so much. In this story, we follow our main character, Mara, the youngest daughter to a kingdom that has actually been sent away to be raised by nuns, kind of removing her from the political picture of this kingdom. Mara also knows that her older sister is trapped in a very abusive marriage to a faraway and very powerful kingdom, so Mara has decided to take it upon herself to go on a quest to try to save her. And at the beginning of this book, Mara is given 3 impossible tasks. She actually completes these tasks with relative efficiency, kind of throwing the Grave Witch who gave them to her for a loop and kind of requiring her to now go on this quest with Mara to save her sister. Along the way, they run into all different sorts of figures who join Mara in her journey. This book is beautiful, dark, it's full of emotion, it has a lot of whimsy. This book is actually under 300 pages, and I just think the author was able to do so much with that story. It was beautifully curated and everything served a purpose, nothing felt rushed, everything felt very fleshed out, and I loved it. Definitely one of my favorite new releases for 2022. Next up, there is Enclaves by Naomi Novik. I have not read this book. I've heard mixed things about this series as well. It is kind of a dark academia fantasy story, but again, I have not read it, and this is book 2 to that series, so we'll just kind of move on. Next up, we have 2 books that I personally did not like. First is The Daughter of the Moon Goddess by C.L. Tan. I was so excited about this book because this is another folklore-steeped fantasy story, and we're specifically following the daughter of the moon goddess who was raised on the moon with her mother, but she's always had to keep her magic secret to kind of keep out of sight of the evil celestial emperor. But one day, her magic kind of flares up, resulting in the emperor knowing of her existence, so she has to flee from her mother and go on a journey to try to save her and also protect and save herself. And this journey kind of brings her throughout the entirety of the Celestial Empire. Conceptually speaking, I love everything about this book. I love a quest, an adventure story. I love a book that's inspired by folklore and mythology, as I've already mentioned. Unfortunately for me though, the pacing of this just didn't really work out for me. I felt like everything felt so fast, and I never felt like I was able to get my emotional bearings within the story. I was entertained by what was happening, but I wasn't like connected or committed to the book itself, if that makes sense. That being said, while I didn't love this book, a lot of people have really enjoyed it, obviously, as it's been nominated. So if it does sound interesting to you, it's definitely one worth kind of checking out and seeing for yourself. I wish I loved it as much as everyone else, but unfortunately, it just didn't land for me. Next up, we also have The War of Two Queens by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I've not read this, but I have read 2 books within this series that this book exists in, and that is the Blood and Ash series. Honestly, like seeing this book alongside some of the most like beautifully crafted, wonderfully constructed plots and characters, like it almost makes me want to scream. But I hate the Blood and Ash series. It is not good at all. There is absolutely no plot. They're so long, so bloated. Nothing happens in the book. Even if you love romance, which I love romance. I love a steamy book. Like I find them fun and entertaining, but even the romance is repetitive. Like nothing escalates in a logical and entertaining way. I just do not like these books at all. If you're not familiar, the Blood and Ash series is kind of like a high fantasy vampires versus werewolves. We have a main character who has to be kept pure and away from everyone else. She's some sort of like religious figure and she's worshipped, and you get the idea. At the beginning of book 1, she's assigned a new guard. Obviously, there's an immediate connection and these characters become involved in one way or another. We get a picture into the politics of this world and how they're evil and there's a rebellion. Overall, I think the setup is actually pretty interesting, and there really was potential to make a fun and steamy like fantasy series. But again, nothing happens. These books are way too long, they're bloated, they're boring, and they're just too much for me personally. So no, I don't think the 4th book deserves to be on this list, just based on the context of the first 2 books. And I even hear they get even worse somehow. But anyway, back to positive news. The next 2 books are ones I have not read, but I feel very confident recommending. The first is The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. This is book 2, the first one being The City We Became, which is one of my favorite books of the year when it released 2 years ago. It was amazing. And I have this book on my shelf. It's on my TBR. I want to pick it up very, very soon. It literally just came out. Some of these books have literally just came out and yet somehow made this list, but we'll leave that aside. But if you have not picked up a book by N.K. Jemisin, I highly implore you to do so. She is just one of the best writers in the game. She has written so many of my favorite fantasy series. They're all highly unique, so well plotted, and just blow me out of the water every single time. But the first book of the series is called The City We Became, and this is an urban fantasy story set in a world where after a certain amount of time, cities can actually become alive. And at the beginning of this book, New York City is kind of on the brink of waking up and becoming its full personified person. But there's some sort of evil force that's sort of preventing this wake up from occurring. And due to this, the city itself is kind of splintered based on the different boroughs into its own individual person. And now these newly awakened boroughs basically have to find each other and take on this evil force and save the city in general. It is so good. Just the concept itself is fantastic. N.K. Jemisin's writing of the city of New York is so amazing. You feel embedded in the different cultures and neighborhoods of this place, and just the way that she celebrates the city is just fantastic. On top of that, in a very clever and unsurprising way, because again, N.K. Jemisin is just so good at what she does, the villain of this book is really, really fascinating. It's sort of this unnamed blobby monster, but is very much inspired by our own societal ills. It's very clearly a metaphor of like what is wrong with our world today, and they are literally fighting this terrible monster and thing and infection, but it's obviously a stand-in for what is wrong with our world. And just all of those things wrapped together just made a very entrancing story. Can't wait to pick up book 2 in the series. I've heard amazing things. It has not been out for very long, so I have not gotten to it. But I still love the series, and I don't doubt that it deserves to be on this list. I can very much say the same thing for the next book on this list, which is The Lost Metal by Brandon Sanderson. This book, at time of filming, has been out for 3 days. When this list was released, I don't even know if the book was out yet. I mean, obviously the fantasy world loves Brandon Sanderson, me included, and this is a very long anticipated release for a fantastic Era 2 to the Mistborn world and series. I love this series. I'm sure I'm going to love this book, but if I had to guess, I do feel like this has a chance of actually winning the best book of the year, again, from like a popularity standpoint, even though it really just came out. But if you're not familiar, this series is actually part of Era 2 to the Mistborn world, which is one of my favorite fantasy worlds and setup. They're so good. And if you haven't checked out Era 1, with the first book being The Final Empire, I highly implore you to do so. In this world, basically, metal is a part of the magic system. Different people can control different alloys of this metal, and they do different things after they consume them. It's all very, very clever. Alloy of Law is actually a flintlock fantasy, and the fun thing about this series is it takes the mechanics and our understanding of a very beloved magic system that we're introduced to, but evolves it through like technological advancement, which would logically take place after some time. This is also, again, a very different series in tone. We follow two main characters that are kind of like Western detectives, and they're basically like solving crimes, going out, doing their thing in the wild, wild west of this fantasy world. It's very, very fun, but of course, Brandon Sanderson is very much known for his plots. Escalation of what's going on is actually very, very, very well done, which is why we've all been anticipating the release of this book, because there has been a few cliffhangers over the course of this series, and we're all looking forward to see how it's going to wrap up. Again, I have not read this book, but I do love this series, and I loved all the books that came before it. I have a lot of confidence, not only based on the reviews that have come out, but just in Brandon Sanderson in general, that I'm going to love it. But obviously, I can't vote for it because I haven't read it yet. But if you haven't checked out the Mistborn world, I do highly recommend it. Next up, we have Thistlefoot by Jenna Rose Nethercott. This is another really great book. I actually recently read this book. This is another folklore, mythology-inspired fantasy story, but it's actually set in modern day and definitely feels very much like a modern fairy tale. So if that's up your street, if that's your vibe, this is a great one to check out. The story is inspired by Jewish folklore and Eastern European mythology and storytelling. And we actually follow two siblings in America, the Yaga siblings. The first is Bellantine, a quiet young woman who likes to keep to herself. She's a woodworker. She really likes to keep her head down and stay focused. And the other is Isaac, who is a wayward street performer. And these two siblings have been estranged for many, many years, separated by many, many miles of the American highway. But at the beginning of this book, they receive a notice that they've actually received an inheritance. And this is a very strange inheritance. It's not money, it's not land, it's a sentient house on chicken legs. And with the arrival of this house, a dark force actually arrives on the shores as well. This book is just really well crafted. It's, again, a beautiful story about reconciliation of siblings. They're traveling together across the country on this house, and also trying to take on this evil force. But alongside like present day chapters, we also get great insight into the character's past. There's kind of magical powers involved. It's all very strange, but it works very well. We also have chapters from the house itself and its history. Like, this book is all about family legacy, remembrance, and like history, even if it's very, very painful. I thought it was beautifully constructed. I thought it was a really interesting book, and also one that I read really, really quickly. It's definitely one of my favorite new releases of the year, so I can see why it made the list. I don't know if it's my favorite fantasy release, but it was very good, and I recommend checking it out. Next up, we have the Atlas 6, a very, very hyped release that got a lot of love on TikTok. Personally, when I picked this book up, I was a little wary, but I actually really loved it. If you want a fun, like dark academia magic story about a bunch of insufferable characters who find themselves in the midst of a secret society, this is a great one to pick up. I loved it for the plot. It was so hard to put down. If you're not familiar, the Atlas 6 centers a secret society, the Alexandrian Society, which is a magical group of people who are all very rich and powerful and control a lot of things. Every decade, they send out 6 invitations to the world's most promising magicians to invite them to try out to join. All 6 individuals who receive these invitations accept them for their own reasons, all coming from their own different specialties of magic, all very powerful and all very curious as to what is going on in this society. But when they arrive, they quickly realize that only 5 people will be able to be admitted into this society, and 1 has to be killed off by the remaining group. It's very dark, very twisty, full of pompous and smart people kind of backstabbing each other, and I honestly thought it worked so, so well. I also think one of the reasons why it was so successful is this book actually has 6 main point of views. We are reading from every individual who received an invitation and who was fighting for a spot to join. It was never clear who was the main character, and so it was kind of hard to parse out like what exactly was going to happen. I love dark academia scenarios. I love people kind of conversing and theorizing like really high level, high concept ideas. Honestly, they're talking about physics a lot in this book, and I really know nothing about physics, but I was able to follow along at a blast while doing so. If you want something that is an absolute page turner, I think the Atlas 6 is a great one to pick up. Do I think it's the best book of this year? No. But do I think it deserves to be in the top 20? Sure. The next book on this list I have not had a chance to read yet, but I've heard such amazing things about it, and that is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I hear this book is charming, delightful, and just a wonderful read from beginning to end. I haven't read it, but I want to. I'm going to be adding it to my shelf very, very soon, and I feel like it'll be a great cozy read for this season. But again, I haven't read it yet, but I really want to. And then to kind of wrap up the books I haven't read that's on the list, next up we have Elektra, a book I own, and I think you might be able to see in frame. It's right there. This is a sort of literary fiction, Greek mythology style story. I personally really enjoy books in this genre, which is why I bought the book. Haven't had the chance to pick it up yet either, but it's definitely on my list. Now moving on to the final 4 books of this list, all of which I have read, and one of those books I feel like is the best new release of the year, and definitely should win. I don't know if it will win, but in my opinion, it should. But first up, we have Stephen King's Fairy Tale. I actually have read this book. This is my first Stephen King story that I've actually ever picked up. This is a portal fantasy, basically following our young main character, Charlie, who is from our world, and he basically inherits a portal in a shed that takes him to another world. And when he arrives there, there's kind of this evil force that has infected the land, and he goes on a quest and adventure with his dog sidekick and try to basically save everyone. I think in a lot of ways this is like really fun. It has kind of the whimsy and the strangeness of like a Phantom Tollbooth sort of vibe, but the darkness and the horror that you would kind of expect Stephen King to inject into a fantasy story. And I found the contrast of those two things to be rather interesting. I don't think this was a perfect book, but it did hook me, and I read it actually pretty quickly. I have a reading vlog coming out for it very, very soon, but I can see why it made this list, and I did like it. Next, we have The Stardust Thief by Chelsea Abdullah. This is a book that was also featured in my new fantasy recommendations. Another book that came out earlier this year, a debut and a first book to a new series that I also really liked. And in the story, we follow our main character, Lowly, who is known as the Midnight Merchant. And with the help of her djinn bodyguard, she's basically able to procure any type of powerful magical item for her clients. At the beginning of this book, though, after helping a wayward and very lost prince, draws the eye of his very powerful father, the Sultan, and basically he tells her she has to go on this quest to basically locate this very powerful lamp, and if she doesn't, she will be killed. So she's forced to go, as I said. She's joined by the Sultan's older son, who is the head of a very notorious group of like thieves and killers, and she basically sets out on this journey. A lot about this book I enjoyed. I found the concept to be obviously a really fun setup. I love a quest. I love following a group of people kind of having to overcome and tackle various obstacles. I found the writing to be overall pretty engaging, and the characters I actually feel like were the best part of this book. Lowly and the side characters were all very intriguing. We had multi-POVs, so we're able to exist in all of their heads. I also found the pacing of the relationships to be very logical. There was a lot of mistrust and like slow build of beginning to understand each other, but it was definitely not overnight, and there's definitely a lot of room for more growth in later installments. I think the weakness of this book was the villain and the pacing with sort of the overall reveal at the end. It was kind of obvious, I won't lie, but I do feel like the strengths of this book outweigh the weaknesses, and I can definitely for sure see the potential of this series. And as a new release, a new series, a new author in the field, I'm excited to see what they come out with next. Next up is actually a speculative fiction fantasy story, definitely a very different vibe than all the books that are on this list, and that is When Women Were Dragons by Kelly Barnhill, another book I enjoyed. I feel like the concept of this story was very strong. Honestly, just the journey of understanding what is happening in this book is worth picking it up alone. It's also not very long, and for me, it honestly leans more in the literary fiction category. I'll accept it being in the general fantasy category as well, because there are dragons. But this is a story set in our world. Everything is the same, but for one key but very substantial difference, and that is women can turn into dragons. This has been humanity's kind of dirty little secret for many, many years. It's always been hidden by the press. It's essentially when a person's rage builds up so much to such a point they basically transform overnight. However, though, there was a mass dragoning so large, and this occurred in 1955, that it basically transformed the world forever because it could no longer be hidden. And we follow our main character, Alex, who was directly impacted by the mass dragoning because her beloved aunt transformed, leaving her and her mother behind. And she herself is kind of grappling with, what is this magic? Why did her aunt decide to leave? Kind of trying to understand and move within a world that just treats her so badly. Structurally, this book is written very much like a diary. We're following Alex at very key moments of her life. She's sort of expressing various stories and feelings she had. And through those experiences, we're getting a small sliver of the experience of dragoning. And alongside those very personal chapters, we also get clippings of like scientific research, political speeches, as people try to grapple with and understand and control the narrative around dragoning. And I think the scientific progress of how dragoning works was a really interesting part of this book. So much is anecdotal, so much is about the pain that many women and many others face as they're kind of oppressed and kind of shoved down by society. And as you kind of begin to learn more about how dragoning works, how it's not associated with a gender or identity in any way, but being more so an expression of like raw rage, it is a really fascinating book through and through. Again, I think the strength of this book is the concept. It's definitely worth the read. I don't think it was perfect, but I think the writing and the characters made a very gripping story through and through. And the very last book that's on the list that I'm going to talk about is the book that I personally think should win the Goodreads Choice Award for Fantasy for 2022, and that is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This book I feel like has a chance. It is very popular, which is key, and also amazing. I also just think of the 20 books listed, it is the best book I think that came out this year. This is R.F. Kuang's new fantasy standalone release. It is a historical fantasy story that is very much inspired by our world and our history. This is in some ways like a dark academia history novel with a splash of fantasy, but it all works so well together. This story, R.F. Kuang held back no punches, and I could not put it down at all. But in this story, we follow Robin, and the story itself opens in 1828, and we see Robin basically taken from his homeland of China and brought to the UK by a very mysterious professor. Once he arrives in the UK, he basically begins a very intense training in ancient Greek, ancient Latin, as well as English and Chinese, all in preparation for his one-day enrollment in the University of Oxford. He will also be a part of a very prestigious kind of translating guild within the university. Once Robin arrives at Oxford, he's really looking forward to kind of assimilating in, making friends, as he's been othered his entire life. But once he kind of gets involved within the translating guild, he quickly realizes that the power of this guild is directly connected to supporting Great Britain's colonial aims, and by helping the guild and by helping the British government, he will also be directly hurting places like his homeland across the entire world. This obviously creates a lot of internal strife within Robin, and slowly we begin to see him turn to student rebellion. This book is amazing in so many different ways. It's a story about identity, it's a story about language, it's a story about loving to learn but being in a place that does not like you, and also uses academia to support racist and problematic ideology. This is a book that is a takedown of academia itself. It's also just a very intense story through and through. Robin as a main character absolutely anchors this book from beginning to end, and I loved it. It's just honestly a masterclass by R.F. Kuang, who I love so much as an author. If you have not read her Poppy War series, I highly recommend checking that out as well. This book had so much hype before its release, and it completely lived up to it, which is very, very hard to do. And again, personally, my favorite new fantasy release of the year, and also the book I think should win the Choice Award for the year as well. But we'll see what happens. Alrighty guys, those are my thoughts and feelings of every single book nominated for a fantasy Goodreads Choice Award this year. Unfortunately, it is a popularity contest, and the books that I like the least will probably make it very far. But on this list though, there are so many fantastic books I highly recommend checking out. So many new authors, so many new voices that are just great. So hopefully this video was helpful in any way, shape, or form, and I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye.